a psychologist, and he works at the University of Birmingham. How do I say it? Birmingham what?
Birmingham.
Birmingham, England, not Birmingham, which we have Birmingham, Alabama here, but Birmingham, England. How's it going, Wilf?
It's fine. We've had our heat wave end, so you can actually live now in England.
Oh, really? It's not hot anymore? How hot was it?
31, 32 degrees Celsius, which is something in Fahrenheit near 100. I
Oh,
don't
wow.
work in Fahrenheit.
Okay. Very cool. All right, so we're going to talk about your podcast. We're going to talk about your work with neuroscience. We're going to talk about your website, water cooler neuroscience. But first, we're going to go to a couple ads from Restream and ECAMM, my two partners. So right now, we're going to go to this Restream ad. Let's see if this works. So Restream will send your live feed to several different platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and then it also has a live studio. It's a very cool product. I'm using it right now to send to Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, and soon LinkedIn. So you don't have to repost everything. It just goes live. And then ECAMM is the software I'm using to record this today. And we have lower thirds and we have logos and all kinds of fun stuff going on. I'm going to play my little animation here for Lights Camera Pro. And then just talk about that in the Facebook and YouTube posts, there is a link to Restream. It's a referral link if you want to check it out. They're a great partner. And also ECAMM has an affiliate link. And if you go and sign up, I will get a portion of the proceeds. So Wilf, you are a neuroscientist. You're the first neuroscientist I've talked to this week.
I think I'm the first neuroscientist most people have talked to in a week.
So how's it going with, let's talk about what you're studying there, and you have a PhD and what you're doing there at the university.
I don't have a PhD yet.
Okay.
Soon.
Working on it.
Next couple of months, I'll have a PhD.
Okay, so what exactly are you working on at the university? What research are you doing?
Okay, so for your listeners, you don't use 10% of your brain. I promise you don't. And when you are using all of your brain, you don't actually want to use all of it on full pelt all the time. Sometimes some things are just not relevant. For example, feeling your socks right now isn't relevant. So your brain will dampen down the parts that are not really being used effectively or just aren't needed. And I study how that works, the actual mechanics of how one place is made more powerful, how one place is made weaker. And this is a completely natural and automatic process your brain does all the time.
Very cool. And so what are you studying as far as or what is your research as far as learning about the brain? Like, what do you, for example, my son had he wants to go to Georgia Tech for computer engineering. He's very good at math, and they were going to study AI, but they were going to study computers controlling computers and telling them what to do in their research labs at Georgia Tech. So it was canceled this year because of COVID. It was an internship, but what are you studying there in the labs? Just everything about the brain, or are there specific things you're studying?
No, so when we put people in a machine, so I study fMRI, which is the one you'll have seen, the big tube. I also study EEG, which is the cap that you have put on the head. And there's another thing that hasn't really hit movies as much called MEG, which is like a massive hairdryer. It doesn't dry your hair, but it looks like one.
Yeah.
And in that, we're able to get people to do tasks where parts of their brain are relevant or not relevant to what we're asking them to do. And we look to see if they get turned on or if they get made weaker or quieter, which we call inhibition. So we study that process. It's not really something that creates a product. It's not something that you'll see on a news article, but it's a really fundamental part about how your brain works that we need to understand for supporting all sorts of other research.
Okay. And we have I just brought up a picture of your brain that you sent me.
That is my brain.
That you scanned. And what can you tell from this picture about your brain, Wilf?
First off, you can tell that I'm a healthy 20-something adult. My brain has no wrinkles. It's quite well sized. Um, you can see that I've got pretty good connection between my two hemispheres. That big white patch in the middle is called the corpus callosum. It connects the two hemispheres. There's no damage. It's full of water, which means it's full of axons, which are connecting wires. They're filled with water. It's very healthy. And other than that, nothing. Because I'm not a medical doctor and I need you to actually use an fMRI. That was done with an MRI, which takes static images, and a functional magnetic resonance imager
Okay,
will
but
tell me what's going on in real time.
You can see that you have a healthy brain. Okay.
Yeah. Also, actually, one of the things you can see on another photo is that I have a vein that wraps around my neck. It's pretty weird, but you can actually see it. Yeah. Apparently, it would make surgery on my neck really difficult, but I think it's cool because I don't need surgery on my neck. So.
Okay, very cool. And I am going to just bring up the logo for your podcast. It's called Water Cooler Neuroscience. Tell me about your podcast, why you started it, how you started it, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing talks about the brain for, God, 7 years. I've done talks on psychology. I've done talks on neuroscience. They are different. I don't really have time to go into it here, but psychology is more about very high concepts like how you process all of your social situations or all of your views about like the thoughts about the future. Neuroscience is more interested, like I said, I look at just how two areas balance themselves out. Talks on neuroscience, I was hired to do them and asked to make them shorter and shorter and shorter, from an hour to 50 minutes to 40 minutes to 30 minutes. You can see where the pattern's going here. There is no short version of neuroscience. It is one of the joke complicated subjects. So if I was to try and dumb it down, eventually I'm cutting out all the background that you need to even understand what I'm saying. And we hit across a problem, which was I would talk about something, I would skip out all of the early background, all of the technical stuff, and just say the findings, which are what the major news articles do. And then we'd have people come later and want to talk, and they would be wrong. They'd be very, very wrong, in fact, but not through any fault of their own. I hadn't given them the tools to understand what I'd said, so they'd taken conclusions and just gone down the wrong direction. If I'd had time to explain more of what I'm understanding, how the brain works, understanding what we understand about the brain, that's a weird sentence, but I promise that there are limits on what we understand about the brain, they would have made more correct conclusions. So I didn't get annoyed at the people who were hiring me. They had their own requirements. So I made my own show. And on our show, we teach you not just what the brain does, but how scientists understand it. And the more you understand the how, the better you understand the what.
Right. And I saw you had a different teachers and different professors on your show who deal with research and the studies of the brain. So can you tell me about one or two of your sort of favorite interviews or most interesting interviews that you've recently done?
Yeah, so we did an episode for season 2 with Dr. Adrian Ward, who is in Texas. He talked about the Google effect. This is actually an effect that's obvious if you understand psychology, but I will explain it for our non-psychological audience. That is that there is something called transactive memory. You will share your memory with basically anything that will let you. And in this case, a pen and paper would let you put down a phone number. You don't need to remember that phone number anymore. That's called transactive memory. It's not all in your own head. Mm-hmm. The internet is the best transactive memory partner ever. It knows everything. So you don't actually need to remember much. And what Adrian studies is how you interact with the internet. How do we use new memory strategies when you are around the internet? And even sometimes when it's not sensible, we can have things put onto a database and tell you that we're deleting them. But because a computer remembered them at one point, and even though it's not useful anymore, you still can't remember things because you're so used to machines taking over for you.
Right.
And it's actually a really sensible strategy. I'm not saying you should get off your phones or anything like that. It is a fantastic plan because the internet is perfect as a memory partner, but it does affect us.
Right. And this is a kind of an interesting question. So when I was in college, I did a one-man show. I was an actor, and I did 14 different characters, and it was an hour and a half show. So I had to remember an hour and a half of material, and I had to go over it every day for 2.5 months. I had to literally just read through the script every day and try and associate different costumes and different props with different characters so I could remember things. There's no way, I'm 52 now, there's no way I could remember that stuff now. It's an impossibility. And I don't know if it's because of the internet or if it's just because of age. Like you can remember things when you're younger. Do you know the answers to those questions?
I doubt it's the internet. When did you do the memorization?
I was probably 20 years old, 19 years old in college in Boston.
So 1930, so 1990s, not 1930s. No, you would have
1910s, yeah.
No, the way transactive memory works is the script is the same as the internet. The script remembers stuff for you. So to be completely free of transactive memory, there would have been a human and you, and he would have told you the whole script and you would have had to remember it. And even then, there is an argument that that of a human being is transactive memory. Aging, however, actually is very similar to an episode I did with, I'll try and pronounce this properly in the way that she pronounces it, Katrine Seiger, who is a fantastic researcher from Netherlands. She speaks so many languages. I probably got exactly where she's from wrong because I am terrible with names and locations. I apologize. But she talked about aging healthily. There has been so much stuff in the news about dementia, Alzheimer's, various very weird things your brain does when it gets older, which aren't healthy. Your brain can't really get cancer, but it can get tumors and stuff, and these happen more as you get older. She studies healthy aging. You will age, and unfortunately, you will lose cognitive faculties.
Right.
They're almost never as good when you're older than when you are younger. It's about 25, 30, and then the decline starts. She studies how people actually just aren't able to remember things as well. You lose your ability to use language as crisply as you would like. So you rely more on old techniques, you rely more on certain words, but you'll be less quick at wordplay, for example. And another episode that I did very recently in my most recent series was with Dr. Gary Donahue in Galloway Island. I'm so bad with names. Maybe my memory has something wrong with it. Maybe I'm actually just failing with my own memory. He talked about psychosis and schizophrenia. But what was amazing about this interview was he was discussing that so he's a practicing clinician as well as a neuroscientist. Very impressive careers. And he was saying that if you came into his lab and you were presenting delusions, the example we used was if you believed you could tell the future, which is obviously impossible, then he isn't going to sit you down and convince you you're wrong. And that's kind of the view that we all get from the media, that you come in with a delusion, you come in with hallucinations, you are going to be pressed until you can no longer admit that they are wrong, and then you are cured. That's not what he said he'd do. He wants to know, why is it important for you to have these delusions? What affected you that you need to suddenly have a admittedly warped view of reality to cope? Because you need to take care of the patient. They are in your care, literally your care. And by understanding that and talking to them and finding out what parts of their life are challenging to them and what they need to have as support, you are far better at making sure they're okay. And he also spoke very passionately on social integration of people with psychosis and schizophrenia. It isn't they're cured and then they're allowed to do some things around normal society. To become cured, you have to be part of society. It's part of the process, not a reward at the end.
Right. And as far as your podcast equipment, what are you using? Are you sitting in your house with the other person, or are you doing it remotely? And then what's your equipment?
So I have my first series and parts of the second season I did with some smart Rode lavalier mics. So clipped on, we sat in their office and we had a chat. I've also done interviews all around the world, and I do not have a budget to go taking flights. I don't have the time to go taking flights all around the world. So I have a toner mic that's over there, which I use when I need my hands more free. And at the moment, I'm using this thing, which is, for our audience, hello. I'm using a Yeti microphone, and I have an ISO ball isolator. It's basically a little sound. It's basically a little sound room for your mic.
Yes. The mic cover that makes it better. And who is your host?
We are our host.
Oh,
really.
So everything's on the website?
Yes, if you are curious, our Computer Girl is our web manager. The services provided by them handle our hosting. They sort out all of the details, and they are actually branching into supporting other podcasts. We were their first project, but they are starting Podcast Manager. So you make a podcast, have a chat with them. They take care of everything for me. I literally just send a couple of MP3s and a badly formatted email, and they make it into a website.
Wow. And they're out of
It's a really
they're out of
useful
England,
thing.
out of Europe?
No, they're out of England. More in the East Midlands. I live in the West Midlands.
Okay.
So, yeah, England's a long, narrow country. We have the North, we have the South, and then we have the Midlands, although apparently the South doesn't recognise the Midlands exists.
But I thought I saw on your website that you're also on Apple Podcasts and other places.
We are.
They are. So you host it on your website, but then you also submit it to those places. Okay.
Yes, and the best thing about being your own host, we have all of our data. So we don't have to go. We're on 44 apps around the world in 81 countries. We don't have to go to 81 countries and 44 apps to find the data. They all get downloaded from our site because we host ourselves.
Right.
And we know all of our data day by day. So we have amazing analytics on how our show's doing, what episodes are doing well, what's reaching traction. I can't imagine being on another hosting site where I would have to request that information. I just, get my phone, send a WhatsApp message, and my web manager gets it to me in minutes. Right. She's really good.
And how are you doing? I mean, obviously, you're a scientist and you're studying research. This is not your project. Your podcast is not here to make money. It's just you're sort of giving this out to the world, these interviews and this information, right?
No, we are, functioning. It doesn't come out of my own pocket. We've had sponsors and we're setting up advertising. Also on our website, we're now setting up a subscription service for people who would like more from the episodes. Okay. So like I said, we're on 44 apps. We are in 81 countries. And over the last few months, last couple of months, particularly the COVID lockdown in the UK, for reference, we had about 3,500 downloads. We had slightly more before that. We don't know why. But yeah. So
how do you, sorry to interrupt,
100 to 1,000 listeners.
Okay, so how do you do advertising? Because there's a lot of podcasters on here. There's people looking for the science stuff, for the podcast stuff. But how do you deal with advertisers? Do you put an ad in the beginning of your podcast, or is it just on your website?
So we're actually our own advertiser. We advertise in the middle of the episode our subscriptions and memberships. However, because we talk about science, we count as a public engagement initiative, meaning that we outreach for science. So we've been supported over the years by 5 public engagement grants and sponsorships to talk about science. Our latest series was sponsored by the Biochemical Society. You'll see them. They just literally paid us the money to talk about it. They didn't want us to advertise a program. They just said, let people know that we did it. It was one sentence, and very generously, we could get on with the rest of the episode. We've also been sponsored by the Centre for Human Brain Health, who do my PhD, and we did some episodes with them, and they were happy to sponsor the show for a short while.
Very cool. And is there anything else you want to talk about as far as the science that you're studying? Because we just talked about the podcast for a second, but is there something that you want to talk about as far as your research?
I would say with our research, it's good to mention, I don't think even in the next 20 years, anything that I'm researching or the people who are more senior than me are researching will really permeate into your lives. But it's important. The way that we understand how the brain interacts in different regions, how it just purely sends information, its basic job to send information, and how it does that, and the mechanisms behind that, is what's called foundational or fundamental research. It is the research that doesn't result in products. It's the research that doesn't result in making a new type of medicine. But it's what those people who do all of those things read so they understand the brain or they understand the body better. So when you are seeing discussions online or on the news about cutting back science funding or cutting fundamental sciences for applied sciences, realize that there is something really important going on. The radio was initially seen as a fundamental science project, not an applied one. And it was done literally as a toy. The guy who actually invented it thought it was a toy. but he understood radio waves. The first understandings about how people sleep was just done to measure brain waves. It was something that we could measure brain waves on for a long period of time. Now it's really important. So foundational science can take a while to become applied to affect you in your daily lives, but you need it there. You need it to also go for decades without really providing you anything before it becomes useful.
And this is kind of a weird question, but is there any sort of research going on? You said we use 10% of our brains. Is there
No, we don't. We don't use 10% of
we
our
don't.
brains.
How much do we use?
All the time.
Oh, we use 100% of our brains.
Absolutely.
Oh, really?
I've literally sat and scanned people and seen it in real time.
Oh, okay, because I was going to say, is there some
promise
way
you.
to enhance it or make it better? But if you're at 100%, there's no way. So that's just a myth, the 10% of your brain.
Complete myth, but I can give you the origin. I do know why the myth exists.
Why?
Your brain is not entirely neurons. So neurons are the cells that we think entirely contribute to thinking. They're capable of sending signals and generating thought and consciousness. But they are very hungry, very demanding cells. They need an enormous amount of oxygen. They need an enormous amount of electrolytes, basically like the stuff you find in Lucozade and Powerade. They also demand a huge amount of sugar and a host of other neurochemicals. They are supported by a life support system called glia and microglia, which are tiny glia. Glia means glue, and it provides the structure, but also the life support for your neurons. When Victorian doctors were first cutting up the brain and trying to understand it, they found the regions that they were looking in were 10% neurons. So they thought that you only use 10% of your brain for thinking. If anybody is curious about could we, genetically modify ourselves to have more neurons but less glia, your neurons need the life support system. You add more neurons, they'll die because they aren't getting the life support because you've removed their support system.
Very interesting stuff, Wilf. As far as I don't know if this is in your wheelhouse or in your area, but as far as concussions with the NFL, have you done any sort of research along those lines or what?
No, but I know somebody who does.
And when the brain is damaged repeatedly like that, does that cause, and this is also for wartime people that are in Afghanistan and they're near bombs and bombs blowing up, there's a damage there. And is there a correlation with any kind of mental health or rage or anything like that?
Okay, so I'm not a researcher in these areas, but I luckily was able to interview quite a number of people who are very educated in it. So I'll refer to what they've said to in my show, and I will try and point out the episodes. So first off, for PTSD, a soldier experiencing a war zone and then having a concussive blow, and an NFL player playing a sport and having a concussive blow, is going to be a very different situation.
Right.
The NFL player is not going to have trauma, which is going to result in an emotional disturbance like PTSD. So that's an added component. However, if you are interested in PTSD, Dr. Julianne Flanagan spoke about this in great detail on her episode in season 3, and she discusses that PTSD has got issues of increased violence and increased rage, but these are rarities within the disorder. But mostly what's going on there is that the brain is just malfunctioning in its overplaying of certain emotions. It's overplaying in fear and it's overplaying in a fight or flight response. And her research looks at using oxytocin, which is actually a binding and very positive neurochemical to it's not that simple that you just take some damage and you add some oxytocin and you cure the brain, but it can help you start a process. As for concussions and inflammation, in season 3 with the Biochemical Society, we talked about this quite a bit. Almost all of the problems your brain has actually come down to energy issues. Your neurons are so hungry for energy. They use 25% of all of the energy you eat goes to your brain. That's how hungry they are. If you think about it, it's only 10% of the weight of your body.
Right.
When they are malfunctioning, they have many problems. They can make you misremember things, as apparently I do on a momentary basis, or they can cause severe mental health issues because they're not communicating the information correctly. So they're incorrectly communicating, and that generates disturbances of thought or disturbances in your biology. If the cells were to get damaged and then inflame on each other and then push on each other, you would suddenly start to have a serious problem. They are going to start crushing each other. They're going to have issues that they are going to not be able to fire properly. The microglia, like I said, those things, those life supports, they could get inflamed. So that's your life support system getting inflamed. So if you imagine that you have a patient who is in a bed in ICU and their life support system starts to get damaged and even start pressuring them, that's a really bad situation. So with the case of concussions, the outside of obviously what a medical doctor is going to talk about, but psychologically, your neurons are being put in a state where they can't get as much food, they can't get as much oxygen, and they're being crushed and unable to communicate in the way they want.
Very cool. And it sounds like your podcast and your website has a lot of episodes about the brain and about brain science, so that if you are either studying it or curious about it, this is the place to go, because you can learn a lot just from listening to these interviews. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm going to do a quick rundown of all the topics that we've ever done. My God. Animal psychology, ape psychology, which is slightly different because apes are actually very clever, but they do some things that we don't. Child psychology. Children are not as inventive as you think they are. Dr. Sarah Beck gave a very convincing argument. How an EEG and fMRI actually works. Not you go in a tube and you lie down. We got a physicist to explain it. And it's a really cool episode.
Right.
Psychopaths. Dr. Stefan de Brito is one of the world experts on psychopaths. And actually, children cannot be psychopaths. It's an adult disorder. However, many children have something called conduct disorder, which looks like psychopathy. And he studies how children with conduct disorder can develop or not develop into psychopaths and sociopaths. Really, really cool episode because he talks about how you have to understand the neuroscience. Sleep. Yes?
Okay, so yeah, let me interrupt real quick because it's kind of interesting. Now, I don't know if this is true. I just read it somewhere or saw it in a documentary. But psychopaths and sociopaths, there was something where they said in an article that it had to do with their brain being damaged as a child, like their frontal lobes or their head being damaged. Is that a myth also, or is that something that correlates with that later in life?
Okay, psychopathy and sociopathy are really, so all of these disorders are really complicated, and they're what's called a syndrome.
Right.
A syndrome like Asperger's syndrome,
Right,
is a collection of symptoms. Yeah, so you can have medical disorders that are a collection of symptoms, instead of just inflammation in your body or an infection that just is an infection. If you were to have damage to the frontal lobe of your brain, the frontal lobe of your brain, in very general terms, helps to handle emotion regulation and control. It doesn't generate those emotions, it controls them. So, most famous case in medicine is a man called Phineas Gage. If anybody doesn't know, he was a railway worker, an explosion went off, and he had a pike go through his eye and up into his brain and out the top of his head. He survived. He actually survived, and most of his frontal lobe was destroyed. He was a very polite, kind, and studious man. After his frontal lobe was destroyed, he wasn't. He was a gambler and a fighter and a very rude bloke. The reason is, the parts of your brain that generate your desire to do things, your ability to do things, your ability to process the world, and your emotions about it are not in your frontal lobe. They're connected, and your frontal lobe controls them in the ways that we would want to achieve the goals we have. Now, if somebody in early life was to have damage to those parts of their brain, it's very possible, yes, they would lose impulse control, which is something that psychopaths have trouble with. They would have issues with emotion regulation. They would also have issues with managing money. Psychopaths are generally very bad at managing money. However, does that mean that that person is a diagnosed in and out psychopath? No, you'd have to get a clinical doctor, and even a clinical doctor or a psychiatrist on the show can tell you.
But it can contribute. It can contribute.
It could definitely contribute, or it could definitely create symptoms that look like psychopathy.
Right.
So it's interesting, but you could very easily have somebody who has damage and be a psychopath, and also have damage and not be. And you could very easily have somebody just be a psychopath without it ever happening. So very complicated, but interesting disorders. That's why there's researchers who spend their lives on them. Right.
Exactly. Okay. One last question before we get to advice for new podcasters and how you put your whole podcast together. Genetics versus environment. So I'll just give you an example. My son is 15 years old. I was never good at math. My brother was. but he is a couple years ahead in math, and he's into computers, and he played a lot of video games, and I think that accelerated it. But how much of your intelligence comes from genes, and how much comes from environment where you study, and like, do you have any insight on that? If you don't, it's fine.
Okay, I can give you I know the basic view, but
Okay.
you would have to get an intelligence researcher to get more deep. Yes, there is a genetic component to intelligence. It's called G, lowercase g. That is general intelligence. Basically, somebody who is really smart will probably be smart in other areas. So if you provide them with something they've not seen before, they're likely to pick it up quicker. However, as with all things genetic, just because you ran track in college and your wife did it, and your wife ran track in college, maybe you've got two recessive genes and your kid just doesn't get those muscle genes and they're not going to run track. They'll be healthy, they'll be happy, but they're not going to be able to do a 15-second like a 15-second 100-meter sprint or something crazy.
Right, I understand.
Yeah. So with mathematics and logic and other general intelligence, you might not have been so great, but clearly your brother has got a mind for it. He has got that logical processing. So the genes are somewhere in your genetic code. And with your partner who you had your son with, they may have then resulted that she will have had a similar gene that will have met better with your family's genetics and resulted in intelligence. However, that being said, if you are really bright, so say that you took the child of two PhDs, really intelligent people, top percentiles of education and intelligence in their countries, and they had a child, and then you remove that child, and you put that child in a third world country in a slum with no education, sure, they're probably going to maybe be a bit bright. They might have some street smarts, but they're not going to be as intelligent as their counterpart who was then taken to Ivy League universities and stuff.
Exactly,
and that's just down to, they were read books, they were presented with new ideas, they were challenged in their intelligence. One of the things that can be really difficult is if you're really smart, maybe you're never challenged and presented with Descartes and Aristotle and Plato, and these sound like really highbrow examples, but they're hard to read.
Right.
So when you're presented with something that's really difficult to read, you need to learn to read it. And that challenge and those new ideas they present to you makes you a more intelligent person. And this isn't just you need to read books. Reading, like watching whatever you deem a trash, terrible TV show versus a really cool, like watching Inception or watching The Prestige. I'm quoting Christopher Nolan movies. Apparently just make your kid watch Christopher Nolan movies.
And then they'll be very smart.
Yeah, then they'll be very smart. That's what a psychologist said. Oh, God. But those movies challenge you. They make you think. So that training of thinking will make you more intelligent. So you see how this works, that you generally need the genes to help, but then you need to nurture that. And obviously there is always going to be a case that somebody can point to of some kid who had really dumb parents, just provably, not intelligent, didn't do well on standardized tests, and they turn out to be able to solve string theory.
Right.
Those things happen. But according to statistics, incredibly rare, crazy situations will happen. So we should take them as the expected anomalies that they are and be grateful that we have somebody who can prove string theory.
Exactly. Okay, so I wasn't going to ask another question, but I am, because where you went. So my son, he goes for this internship at Georgia Tech, and I say to the professor, I say, well, what is he going to be learning? And he says, well, really, the first few months, he's going to learn how to think differently. He's going to learn how to think in a different way. And I said, in what way? And he said, it's more of a analytical, it's a different way that most people think. It's hard to explain, but we will train him with articles and problems and give him problems to solve and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, wow, that's just, you're going to train him how to think differently? Is that something that you've heard of before? Or?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I'll give you two examples. So I was 8 when Y2K happened. And I was told that planes were going to fall out of the sky, humanity was going to end. And obviously, I'm very appreciative that so many coders did so much work to make sure that the Y2K transition happened without huge disruption, and appreciated, because that would have made my teenage years very different.
Right.
But I was presented with, I presented my teachers with a comment, which is, if you have planes that are going to fall out of the sky at midnight, why don't you just not fly at midnight? I wanted to know why.
Yeah.
And that was the thing. It was this very hyper logical thinking. Now, that was what I had as a kid. When I went to university, my supervisor, Dr. Stephen Mayhew, is a unfortunate master at brilliantly logical breaking down of information. And he taught me how to think. And not in a, Orwellian, think this, don't think this. It was just challenging me on ideas, endlessly making sure that I was able to argue properly. Not say I have a hunch, not say I think, not say it seems to me that way. And we've got different opinions, but we're just thinking different ways. When you say we think in different ways on something that has a clear proven answer, like how much oxygen is in a jar, and that can relate then to many other scientific politicized arguments I'm not going to get into, you're saying I probably think you're right and I don't want to go down this argument. But at university, you're not allowed to do that. So let me present a more fun way I could present how the analytical thinking starts to kick in. I'm currently watching the Netflix show Snowpiercer.
Okay.
This show bothers me endlessly. My wife tells me to shut up about how much it bothers me.
Wait. Is it the TNT show or is it the movie? It's the TNT show.
I've seen the movie. I actually think the movie is better made. I think the movie has a better consistent logic to it than the TV show. But I'm talking about the TV show with Jennifer Gardner.
Jennifer Connelly.
Jennifer Connelly. My bad. Wrong one. God, I am so useless with names. Anyway.
Go ahead.
Now, I'm about to point something out. It's going to ruin the show for you, and I apologize. They've shown the morgue is about halfway along the train. Yeah?
Yeah.
And when they collect bodies from the end of the train, because the train, if anybody's curious, the back of the train is the worst. It's a allegory for capitalism. The top of the train is very rich. The back of the train is very poor. When they remove the bodies, they have to go through this they have to go through this set of cars that anybody who's seen the first episode will see. They're filled with these shanties. They're filled with these bars. They're filled with this fruit sections and stuff. How do you cart a body through that when you can't get through yourself? How do you transport? Now, the issue is with a train, right? You've got to logically go from one to another. It makes no sense.
Well,
and
I'm going to interject here and say, couldn't they go on top of the train and drag it?
It's minus 200 degrees outside the train.
Okay.
So let me point out another thing that makes no sense about this series. Absolutely no sense. One of the things I don't understand in the slightest is how you can have... Let me try and think of the way I want to phrase this. There are people in the train who have enormous amounts of wealth, right? But one of the things that the show is not talking about, and this is on, again, a very analytical point of view, is there is people who've not paid to be on the train, they're stowaways, requesting a better standard of life for something that is a very clear capitalist product. But there's no space on them. The entire premise of this train is that everything on this train is controlled. It's an entirely maintained ecological system, and everybody who was checked into the train had a space and a food allocation, and all of the preparation for that food was managed. You don't add 400 new people in, you obviously throw off the equations completely.
Right.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So they have no argument, because there's no way to support them. But the show doesn't provide that, doesn't look at that very interesting analytical argument that you can have in a university. So if you want something that's very interesting in a university, you can have unbelievably dispassionate arguments, no emotion. The discussion of, do those 400 people deserve the food and water that they request? Now, obviously, in normal society, we say immediately. They're living human beings. They have the right to be fed. And ethically, of course, we have things like the NHS and Social Security, and I'm not saying that. But in a university, you can debate, and nobody will get angry at you, that they don't deserve food and water. And the ability to test that logical argument and have people argue back at you about that logical argument massively expands your ability to think and discuss things without emotions getting in the way.
Right.
So it's an amazing opportunity to get to learn. And obviously, if you were to put that argument forward, people would be horrified. But that means that you lose out on an ability to debate calmly and without upsetting people. That robs you of a certain ability to talk and understand. So very much in the same way that law and history and philosophy have these great traditions of debate, Science does too. So your son will get to learn. He'll put forward an argument for a model. So a model is just a system of a computer science, and a fellow colleague or a professor will challenge him.
Right.
But it will be a very constructed this piece, this piece, this piece. So just as I'm going, it makes no sense that you can't get a trolley through one of the most busy cars. That doesn't work. And just the logic of it turns up to me. That's because why do you need 19 people in an experiment? Why not 25? I mean, you're going to present stuff on the left side of the screen. What about the right side of the screen? Really basic logical questions. But they train you just to think. So it sounds really creepy when a university says they're going to train you how to think, but it's just challenging you, and from that you develop your own ways of thinking. Right. We also all do not think the same. Go to a debate between PhDs and you'll see very quickly we all do not think the same.
I'm sure.
If anything, it actually powers you. It empowers you to know what you think. It makes you more individual.
Yes, I can see that. So let me ask you, I don't even know if this is a question, but I just want to see how you feel about this, because this is something that's really cool that's happened in Atlanta, Georgia, where I am, that came out of somebody's study at Georgia Tech for their, I don't know if it was his master's or his PhD, but it was his final presentation. So around the inner city of Atlanta was a train track system, and it dissolved. It went away. So it was all trash and graffiti. Sorry, I got to drink something. And he said, why don't we turn this into a walkway where people can walk, bike, and run, exercise, ride bikes? And they did that. And it's called the Atlanta Beltline. It took a couple decades. It's still going. He wanted to have a streetcar included. But what that did is it took all the people who were going to the suburbs and brought them back into the city, right? Because now you have a place to walk. You can walk to work. You can bike to work. You can bike to dinner. You can walk to dinner, which is where I live now, close to it. And it's an amazing thing, because in the suburbs, you're always driving in your cars, right? To go to the grocery store, dinner, everything you do is in your cars. So it's a pretty amazing thing, and it's still going, but it's also become this political thing with the recent protests, and people will spray paint stuff on the Beltline, and they'll actually protest on the Beltline and walk together. People will play music on the Beltline. It's a really incredible thing, and it all came from one guy's idea. So I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
Well, first off, one thing coming from somebody's ideas is normal. That's university to me. That is academia to me, and research. The concept of the Beltline is fascinating, and I can see why. It also would, there's an even better argument of adding multiple concentric circles. Right. You know, so obviously Atlanta's a big city. To walk, if you wanted to walk around, say that you have the center of the city here, and then you want to get to a diner here. Now, if you're over here, you could walk along and then go down. Right. But maybe there'll be another concentric circle that would help you to navigate around without going through all of the island. So that's interesting. But I think there has been an increasing implicit request, particularly when COVID started. Everybody's like, my God, we're going to suddenly have a collection of society. We're going to come back together again. And it didn't really happen. That is due to fair discussions that people need to have about how we fit in society. As a scientist, is not my place. It is your place to decide how you think about that. But we clearly want to be more together. Right. The Beltway offers that. You can't be together in a car. Well, you can, obviously, with the people around you, but you can't be together on a highway, I guess is the better way of phrasing this. But on a street, you can see, on a street, you can have people playing music, hopefully good buskers, not annoying, screechy buskers like we get in Birmingham. Please, can we get a better standard of busker? But I really like when they're good. I just don't like when they're bad. But the Beltway clearly shows that in Atlanta there is a discussion. However, when obviously you bring forward a place, a social place, people are going to protest because they know there's an audience. They are going to graffiti because they know there's an audience. So that always brings up the question. As soon as you start to see graffiti, as soon as you start to see protests, that is simply a bubbling up of people wanting to discuss anything. And if anything, you should almost see what is the graffiti about. You know, if it's actually real graffiti, if it's graffiti, if you know, there's a problem in Atlanta, there's a problem we need to talk about, not just graffiti for the sake of graffitiing. That's almost a call to discussion. real discussion. And that's what hopefully people take from higher levels of education when they can have access to them. If you can't, although I know you're watching this and you don't have access to higher levels of education, there are places you can go to debate. Christ, hit me up on Twitter and we'll have a debate. Just that kind of discussion about, should there be a one-child policy in the world? We have an exploding population. Now, I have no personal hat in this ring.
Right.
So if you want to present a position and you want to learn clear, logical debate, set your position and we'll talk with no emotion. No, but my dad wants to have another kid and I think he should have the right. No, but why does any person deserve the right to have 2 children? Right. Or, my sister should. Those are emotional arguments. You're using family members that I know are matter to you. Don't talk in that way. Talk about this in a clear, removed way. And the reason is because, say you have 2 groups and say that somebody is concerned about littering in the inner city. So they make a Banksy-style graffiti, saying there's too much litter. As soon as you get onto emotional debates, nobody's listening. People are just going to say, we shouldn't graffiti because you're dirtying up the city and it's your people's fault that you're making this, millennials or boomers or pick group that you want to be annoyed at. From a psychological point of view, you've stopped the discussion. And the other group's going to go, but it's your fault, etc. But if you learn to just talk about it and, how much, do we have litter? Can we remove it? What are the mechanisms by which our council or state can remove it? Is there a minimum amount that we just can't get rid of? And how can maybe we do something about that? Can we have an integrated process where we, the citizens, take place? Without stone slinging, without emotional pleas, well, you've solved the problem. So I'm not saying you can't have emotion. I'm not saying to all be robots, but for debate, for talking about really charged,
get rid of the emotion, yeah.
For really charged topics, even for the most emotional topics, sometimes talking about them without emotion can show you a lot about what you're actually debating.
Right.
And sometimes there isn't even a debate there. Sometimes you just want to scream at somebody, and that's on you.
Right. Okay, so we've learned a lot about the brain today. I have, and I'm sure the viewers have. And they will if they continue to go to your podcast, which I'm going to bring up your logo here again. But can you talk about, we'll just wrap it up because we usually go about 45 minutes. We're at 47. Can you talk about how long have you had your podcast? How many years?
We've been releasing episodes since August last year.
Okay. So can you just talk about any advice you would give to anyone, young, old, just starting a podcast?
Sure. First things first, quality. However good you can make it, make it. That doesn't mean go online and buy a 1,000-pack podcasting package, but however good you can make it that good. Second, beg, bribe, borrow, offer platonic favors, whatever, to get an editor. It is really hard, and getting somebody who knows what they're doing is enormously helpful, even if it's just giving you a few pointers when you've finished. And the other thing I'd say is, wherever you are, I assume you're in the first world, in America or Canada or the US. If you're looking at this from further afar, I don't know, so I apologize. There will be some sort of entrepreneurial support, business support, guiding support. If you treat your podcast like a business that has to have a product of quality that you give to a customer and you respect their time, that will make it better. And there are people in your state, in your county, in your city, who will be offering support for those things and not charging you. Most cities have entrepreneurial support, so you can just get advice on how to make a better product. And that means your show's better, and that means more people will want to listen.
Right. I totally get that. That's great advice. And I interviewed this guy, Eric Carter Landon, out of New Mexico, and he does a true crime podcast about unsolved murders and some other things, some paranormal stuff. And it's very popular. Ooh. I mean, something like 30,000 downloads an episode. But
wow.
But he said that he had a woman who was even more popular than him that had million downloads an episode, and she called him and she said, "You're doing a great job. I love the stories," because there's music. It's almost like a feature from a television show, his podcast. And she said, "You're doing everything great, but I need you to make better quality. So I need you to get better mics. I need you to record it better, and then you're going to go to the next level, because right now everything is great except for the quality."
Yeah, no, I've received the same advice. When I started, I had a couple of 30 quid mics that I got on a grant. Then I was able to get a 70 quid mic. I now have a better one, which provides what I think is pretty good quality.
Yeah.
And we've been able to bring on a professional editor. We got our intros and outros made professionally. So it wasn't done overnight. I didn't just pour a huge amount of my own money in, get in debt and start a show and not know where I was going to go. Right. But I made the best show that I could. And then
improved as you went.
I went, but also I went to other people and got them to come on board. I got them to see that there was a next step. You know, when people say that we got like 30,000 downloads an episode or 1 million downloads an episode, it is very rare they did that entirely by themselves.
Right.
Quite often they'll have a large studio backing them, and those studios they want new shows. Yeah. You can go talk to them.
Yeah.
It's not that, you know, that person got that show, went to that studio and they're done. They're never going to talk to you. Or you get partners who can help you get better equipment. You can get partners who can help you see see more of the world. Lots of people will love your show, but just don't know it exists. And that's about finding a partner that can get the word out for you. So we took on a marketing manager this year who helps us spread the word. These are just things you can do that slowly build up. But it took me a couple of years before I had all these things in place, and we're still growing.
Right. Fantastic, Wilf. You're awesome. I'm sure you got to go do some stuff at the university or just relax after a long day.
It's late here. I'm going to eat.
Eat some food. I appreciate this so much. I will text you when this turns into an audio podcast in about 4 to 6 weeks and send you a copy, whatever you need of the video, of the audio. I appreciate you being a guest, and this has been a lot of fun talking to you, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, man. Have a good one. Take care. Keep in touch.